water real quick? Get your water. Here's what's in the fridge job.
Oh, great, thank you. No, I don't care. Okay, do you want to put them on? Oh, wow. These are serious. That's fine. I gotta go.
Thank you for being here, everyone. My name is Adam Overton, and I'm going to be delivering a lecture today by a friend of mine, Matador Oven. The lecture will probably take about 35 to 40 minutes to complete. And then after that, we'll take a short intermission of maybe like 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll do a short concert that will be about 30 minutes in duration. Well, maybe more like 30 or 40. This lecture is by, as I said, by Matador Oven, and I translated it, and he's also the author of a booklet called A Dabbler's Manifesto, of which I have a handful of copies, which is a separate publication. But the lecture tonight is titled Ripe for Embarrassment for a New Musical Masochism, and it's available online as a downloadable PDF on the Experimental Music Yearbook's website. And so, first off, thank you so much to Kristi Anderson and others at Experimental Music Yearbook for publishing this and many other fun pieces this year and in the past. Thanks to the wulf for hosting this. Okay. All right, so Ripe for Embarrassment for a New Musical Masochism. First, it should be noted that this paper was first delivered as a lecture with slides at the Kristi Engle Gallery in Los Angeles on January 25th, 2012, just over a year ago. And it was presented on a program with Allison D'Amato as part of Carol McDowell and Asher Hartman's series, A Little Louder Performance and Conversation. So, in 2005, while a composer and student at Cal Arts, I witnessed the premiere of a piece by my good friend Adam Overton, who now lives up in San Francisco. That piece, titled Forbidden String, from 2004, and its subsequent performance inspired this lecture, but it's taken me several years to finally collect my thoughts all in one place. And since then, my thoughts on the topic have expanded in some fun directions. According to Fong's description of the text-based work on his website, the score of this piece instructs the performer what not to do. It presents a sequential and cumulative list of dictates in the form of forbidden strings and mixed out techniques. Not too fast. Do not play louder than mezzo piano. Do not play with vibrato. Do not play on the first string. Do not play staccato. Do not play on the second string, and so forth. The player here finds her or himself oppressed by a score cruelly tightening its vise of musical options. The thought of such impending doom, of the performer slowly being suffocated to silence, is a striking one. In other words, I can't help but desire some kind of rebellion on the part of the performer, to either subvert the sad ending to this piece, or to at least go out in a blaze of glory. Interestingly enough, by the end of that 2005 performance of Don'ts, I found myself equally aghast with the violist's interpretation. The piece was, by all memories of it, one of the most succulent things I'd ever heard. My reaction at first appeared to be an embarrassingly common response to a violent act wherein one doubly victimizes the victim by asking such insensitive after-the-fact questions like, "Why didn't you fight back?" But before leaving the concert hall that night, I came to realize that I hadn't actually witnessed any attack. Instead, the performer and composer were very obviously in cahoots. They were collaborators, and in this performance, even with results unknown to the composer, their relationship had been entirely consensual. This only ruffled me more. It became clear that the sadistic, directorial tone of Adam Fong's Forbidden String had been a ruse. The composer isn't actually punishing the performer, and really has very little control over the ultimate interpretation of the work. Put another way, of the nearly infinite options from which the performer has to choose, there are really only 18 they must avoid. Only 2 rules, one in the form of the title and another in the form of the technical jargon used throughout the score, suggest what should be done, that a string instrument be used. And that's only if you wish to take Fong literally. The rest of the score's maxims are open to the performer's interpretation. Upon this realization, my post-adolescent mind gleefully imagined a more delightful extreme. Shit, 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 shit. An alternate universe where we might witness an equally clever and virtuosic performer adhering just as well to the disciplined calls of the composer and the score, reaching into the same grab bag of possibilities provided, but pulling from it the most depraved sounds and actions the performer's anus could muster. I spoke with Adam Fong afterwards about my fantasy, asking him whether he finds such a shitty performance embarrassing and acceptable. He grinned widely and bravely stated that indeed it would be all right, and that no, he wouldn't be embarrassed. Despite what seemed like an honest admission on his part, it seemed clear that he himself probably wouldn't push an instrumentalist for such a shitty performance. And I quietly wagered that if presented again in a similar setting, without forewarning from a more sinister violist, he'd likely break a sweat quite unlike the one he might have experienced during its premiere. In the world of experimental composition, we call the openness to widely differing interpretations of a work indeterminacy. Popularized by the likes of Christian Wolff, Earl Brown, John Cage, Morton Feldman, and others in the 1950s and 1960s, the principle of indeterminacy was simple. The performer is given a hand in making important choices as to how certain elements of a work will be realized. He or she is often presented with a range of options for any instrument, for 1 to 100 players, for any duration. Perform some, all, or none of the following. As a result, the landscape of indeterminacy is populated with re-performances of works that barely or in no way resemble previous incarnations. This approach serves as one of the primary foundations of what we might think of as a Cageian experimental practice, that the realization of a work might or even should produce unforeseen results, perhaps surpassing the expectations of the composer. As Cage himself states, "I write in order to hear the music I haven't yet heard." For Cage, this process of opening oneself to the universe of possibilities was a Buddhist strategy of freeing oneself from the shackles of one's own likes and dislikes, but relinquishing one's desire to make interesting, sentimental, or important work. At first glance, this Buddhist sublime is much less dramatic than the more God-fearing versions of the West. Here, instead of explosiveness, we often find the boring and the bland, a zone where sound is simply sound or even silence, where performers perform disinterestedly, and the listener is confronted with a work drained of any intentional narrative. And as Christian Wolff points out, a submissive Cage was constantly looking for strategies for making that unpredictability happen by some force other than his own decision. Turning to the chaos of chance by flipping coins to compose works, and then turning to the indeterminacy of the performer when he wanted them performed. Hold on to that thought. Despite all of this lofty experimental talk of shifting decisions from the composer to the performer in order to create strange and surprisingly banal new renditions of the same work, in practice, indeterminacy has, in my experience, rarely ever been used to its most awesome or awful potential. Through decades of exposure, composers and performers alike have grown comfortable with a conservative indeterminacy that produces pretty predictable results that don't sound all that bad. Contemporary composers and performers can share the blame for engaging in such faux indeterminacy. For instance, in some cases, the ability of indeterminacy to surprise us has been dampened by composers who implement it in small, predictable doses, as indeterminate flourishes, or by providing a slim buffet of options from which the performer has to choose. Such tendencies also subtly indicate an underlying paranoia about working with reckless performers. In this latter case, Christian Wulf kindly models for us the mindset of the wary composer, who checks their piece for sabotage-worthy loopholes by asking her or himself, well, what's the worst I could do with these freedoms that I have here? What could I do that would be totally unacceptable to me? It is, of course, within the rights of the composer to shape the parameters of their work. That is the work. However, the dangers of the chaotic performer of the last half-century are perhaps a bit overblown. In fact, musicians have traditionally been the most conservative, resistant anti-force in experimental music, who have often tended again and again to betray their blindness to the liberties afforded them in indeterminate works. They're much more well known for simply failing to read and then follow the instructions. Perhaps the most common fault of instrumentalists are their inability to smell themselves. Even the best, most determinedly indeterminate instrumentalists are frequently unable to escape the beautiful sound of their conservatory training. As a result, we still tend to hear a lot of Schubert at a Cage concert. Other instrumentalists who are less blind to the shackles of their discipline tend to beat back these conservatory tendencies with the use of extended techniques and other odd sounds from their instruments. The result, however, is usually a disruption of the highly sought-after Cageian blandness, sounding more like the discovery of the hidden prize within the composer's scavenger hunt. In the least common but still occasional case, the instrumentalist decides, fuck this shit, and becomes a clown. As Christian Wulf reports, Morton Feldman had this happen to him a number of times with those graph pieces. People would just play tunes. But before we completely crucify the performer, let's step back to the composer, specifically to Cage. As Joe Pansner points out, as an avant-gardist, Cage was born of a time wherein his work was actively deplored by audiences and instrumentalists alike. As a result, he too found himself facilitating in hierarchical ways that limited the scope of his indeterminacies. For instance, he often lacked performers who would take his work seriously. Since he lacked performers who would take his work seriously, he was forced to work with this small, incestuous coalition of the willing, who in his mind harbored the discipline to study and learn the work. The majority of Cage's work during this time in the 1950s and 60s was therefore performed by his close and highly skilled friend, pianist David Tudor. Though brilliant, through repeated collaboration, Tudor's interpretations likely became a known and trusted quantity to Cage. In other cases, especially after Tudor left his side in the 1970s to pursue his own work as a composer, Cage didn't just hand out his scores and then disappear. He worked very closely with his initiate performers, helping to shape their interpretations via rehearsal, dialogue, and disapproval of choices that didn't fit his agenda or taste. In at least one situation that we'll look at in a moment, where Cage made himself and his work exceptionally vulnerable to the indeterminacy of the performers, he found himself lashing out against an interpretation of his work that, in his mind, was perpetrated in bad faith. It's important to note that for Cage, his well-known anarchist position was in fact not in favor of modeling individualistic chaos on stage, but instead emphasized a form of personal responsibility and self-respect, wherein the performer, though freed primarily from their own tastes, also attended to the various interests and intents of the composer as illustrated and implied in the work. A relationship, therefore, was formed as the composer and performer would consent to collaborate, with the score acting as a starting point. As collaborator Peter Kotick recalls, once the performer had considered both the score's written instructions and the context in which the work would be presented, Cage would then help shape the work further by acting as a coach or dramaturg, communicating a third level of instruction, in a sense, an unwritten metascore. It was his job to point out the performer's latent zones of self-interest or habit that might emerge during rehearsal, or gestures that might seem too culturally significant when presented on stage. According to Kotick, the only way of getting to this third level was by working directly with Cage or one of his close associates. Such an approach is oddly familiar in the work of Marina Abramovich, whose 7 Easy Pieces has a similar third level metascore overarching the performance of her works. As she commanded a friend of mine in a cease and desist email in 2005, there are similar rules for reperforming my performances. 1, ask original artist for permission. 2, understand the concept of the piece through the conversation with artist if still alive, and study available documentation. Only then, when you have written permission from me, would it be possible to make your own interpretation. What you are doing is not right. I personally think such an approach, that of applying or requiring a third level metascore to some or all of one's actual written scores, is terribly interesting, and in fact many of my contemporary composers, or my favorite contemporary composers, write many such metascores as a practice unto itself. And so I don't in any way claim that it's misguided. I, of course, fear what may become of a work of mine in the hands of others, assuming wrongly that they will all share my sensibilities and experiences and will magically get the implied messages that I've forgotten to write directly into the score. In the case of Abramovich, her metascore simply emphasizes the discipline of her physical practice, one which she has tied to the discipline of a court painter hired to create portraits of the king, pope, and other divine beings. For her, such holy work requires an equal amount of pious research and self-sacrifice on the part of the performer. Both Cage's and Abramovich's practices are united in their severe, disciplined, self-denying Buddhist nature. Now back to Cage. Though often thought of as a gentle anarchist, Cage too has exhibited righteous indignation in defense of the perceived misuse of his work. According to Cageian, the most well-known instance was in 1975 when composer Julius Eastman used his indeterminate discretion to deliver an odd lecture while performing Cage's songbooks. Never shy about his gayness, Eastman lectured on sex with a young man, his boyfriend, and a woman, his sister, as volunteers. He undressed the young man on stage and attempted to undress the woman who resisted. Though Cage himself had emphasized that the work in this concert not be rehearsed, therefore ruling out anyone knowing ahead of time what the performers might do, he was still furious afterward about the incident, stating, "No matter how many times I say, you can't do anything you want, but anything goes, everyone interprets it as, I can do any goddamn thing that I want." Obviously, I didn't witness the performance myself, and I have only caught a glimpse of the performance via a recording and documents that documents only Eastman's voice and the audience's nervous whispering and giggling. I'm sure it was an uncomfortable moment for Cage, and I respect that what happened, all mythological descriptions and hype aside, it likely probably seemed, or maybe even was, unnecessarily disrespectful or undisciplined at some level. However, what disturbs me most about Cage's response is the sinking feeling that perhaps the exciting, indeterminate project that he began might never have fully taken off. It seems to me that true indeterminacy might not be possible unless one is willing to risk getting one's feelings hurt, willing to endure the sublime embarrassment of the failure of one's score to fend off saboteur. So, having witnessed Adam Fong's indeterminate score be so unnecessarily beautified by a violist in 2005, and then having learned of John Cage's allergic response to embarrassment, and hence to an updated and potentially more potent form of indeterminacy, in the years since I've begun to desire a new kind of relationship between the experimental composer and performer. The stirring in my loins tells me that instead of the performer acting submissively to a domineering composer, we might now imagine a new musical masochism with the composer as a bossy bottom, opening him or herself to a consensual act of humiliation with the performer, who punishes the composer for the lax, unclear, or imprecise instructions of their score. This new musical masochism I envision springs forth from the tradition of its namesake, Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, the Austrian writer and pervert from 1830, born 1836, died 1895. For the uninitiated, it's worth noting that masochism, according to Masoch, had nothing to do with the sadism of French author Marquis de Sade, who was born a century earlier. Today's sadomasochism mostly resembles Masoch's system of role-playing, where the sadism, if he would even permit that term, is highly calculated and simulated. De Sade's was quite the opposite and focused on describing one sordid violation after another, usually without the consent of the victims. Masoch's writing is instead romantic courtship fiction at its best, at its most suspenseful, at its most sexless, where pleasure is postponed for as long as possible. What makes this postponement so strange is that it's the supposed victim who desires and composes this play of perverted, pitiful martyrdom. As Masoch's submissive narrator in Venus in Furs puts it, the comic side of my situation is that I can escape, but do not want to. In fact, contrary to appearances, it is via his or her direction, as outlined in a written or spoken contract, that all of the mistress's actions and appearances are governed. Gilles Deleuze, who wrote at length about Masoch's work, describes this masochistic hero as being the one who forms her, the mistress, dresses her for the part, and prompts the harsh words she addresses to him. It is the victim who speaks through the mouth of his torturer without sparing himself. Masoch's contract, or for our purposes, the score, which appeared in his books and in his personal life as well, serves then to educate the mistress as to the particular laws and conditions under which he is to be enslaved. This desire to contract with one's torturer in this way highlights the very consensual aspect of the composer-performer's masochistic alliance, as well as the exceedingly manipulative pleasure the composer receives upon successfully seducing the instrumentalist to perform his or her piece. However, while this pact fleshes out the minimum mistreatment to be administered, what the masochist ideally desires is a sublime punishment that ultimately exceeds the limits of his own imagination, setting the stage for a game of calculated and improvised cruelty within a field of masochistic indeterminacy. You have brought my dearest fantasies to life, Severin exclaimed. They have lain dormant too long. And what are they? Says Wanda. She put her hand on the nape of my neck. A sweet dizziness came over me on feeling the warmth of her little hand and on meeting the tender searching gaze that she let fall on me through half-closed eyes. To be the slave of a woman, a beautiful woman who I love and worship. And who in return ill-treats you? Laughed Wanda. Yes, who fetters me, whips me, and kicks me, and who all the while belongs to another. And who has the impudence, after driving you mad with jealousy, to confront you with your happy rival, to hand you over to his brutality? Why not? Or does the final picture appeal to you less? I looked at Wanda in horror. You exceed my wildest dreams. Ah, we women have fertile imaginations, she said. Beware, if you do find your ideal, you may well be treated more cruelly than you anticipated. Throughout Masoch's Venus in Furs from 1870, Once the pact has been consummated, the reader witnesses again and again the masochistic role play between Wanda and Severin. At first, Wanda struggles to conceal her care for Severin, but it is her devotion to him and to their agreement that pushes her to continue treating him so callously. In this masochistic game, we discover that clumsiness, most likely intentional, on the part of the slave/composer, is often common cause for triggering the mistress/performer's whip. And we witness again and again Severin stumbling into various infractions. In the early tryouts of their new roles, we find the cruel mistress postponing any pleasure for her lover via a sequence of commands, but then finally relenting and rewarding her slave with kisses and other affections by the end of the display. Here we see that it is ultimately agreed that however treacherously the performer acts while faithfully executing the masochistic score, both parties will continue to demonstrate their indebtedness via eventual acts of forgiveness. Love knows neither virtue nor merit. When we love, we forgive and forget everything, for we have no choice. As one last stimulating scenario illustrating Masoc's fantasy, he describes his desire to be sewn up in wolf skins and then hunted like game by his mistress. I discovered that a similar fantasy emerges within Zachary Drucker's Lost Lake from 2010, as the trans protagonist heads into the woods, gun at her side, for some pervert hunting, shouting, "Pervert, pervert, gonna get you, gonna get you."
Pervert! 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 Gotta get you. Gotta get you. Gotta get you. I'm gonna get you. I'll go get you. Get you good. I'm looking for somebody who wants to go pervert hunting with me. Get me a pervert today. It's turkey season for you, but it's pervert hunting for me. Anytime. That's enough. I'm gonna fill you up, pervert, full of lead this time. Then I'm gonna burn your house down. This is what I'd like to do to your magnificent property, pervert. I would like to make this for you. I am going to burn your house down.
Okay. So, it is indeed pervert hunting season in composer country. The composers I'd like to hunt are ripe for embarrassment. I propose a new musical masochistic landscape full of indeterminate peril that continues where the avant-garde fantasies of our four mistresses left off. Having initially proposed this fantasy years ago, it's been surprisingly challenging for my imagination to make any headway beyond that post-adolescent dream of a shit performance. While satisfying on one level, I've continued to wonder what other wooded footpaths the performer might tread while out walking the hounds, their gleaming clarinets slung over their shoulder, on the lookout for clumsy composers. It's taken me some time, but I've discovered it's possible, in fact, to go in several other rousing directions. The following list is by no means exhaustive, and hopefully represents just the beginning of our composer hunting fantasies. All right, so punishment number 1, scat play and other post-adolescent indecencies. We've already talked about this one, which might also be termed scatological absurdism. It's worth noting that though Cage has been greatly glorified for his charitable work, towards letting sounds just be sounds, his perhaps more important contribution has been to expand the field of music to welcome the non and extra musical. As a result, it can be argued that experimental music today is populated more with requests for action and inactions than for sounds themselves. It's in this spirit that we here publicly reward any and every clumsily indeterminate instruction with the basest interpretation possible. Excrement is of course a great starting point, but we're also open to other humiliating forms, up to and including the realms of Beavis and Butthead-esque psychodrama. The next handful of punishments are based on a labor tactic known as work to rule or malicious compliance. That in a workplace environment generally means restricting output, undermining quality, or cutting back service by working strictly by the book. This kind of strategy is often most desirable in situations where striking could result in mass firings. So instead, in a work to rule campaign, workers strictly follow company rules and the contract and do only what they are told to do. They leave their brains at the gate and make no extra efforts. They ask their supervisors how to solve problems rather than solving them themselves. They forget the shortcuts they have developed to speed production. They ask managers for help with every job. They perform every task meticulously. They follow all safety procedures to the letter. They do not start work a second before they must, and they do not work a second longer than required. They refuse voluntary overtime and take every minute of every break. They grieve every dispute, no matter how trivial. In short, they use management's rules against the company. So, punishment number 2 is malicious compliance. Leave your brain at the factory gate. Such strategies can be used against the masochistic composer in multiple ways. One option is to leave your brain at the factory gate during rehearsals by subtly refusing to make any choices by yourself, instead asking the composer again and again for advice in interpreting their score. Our ultimate aim in this endeavor is to eventually perform a work whose indeterminacy has been greatly influenced or perhaps even completely ruled out by the composer him or herself. One such example where this appears explicitly is in Adam Overton's Bits and Pieces, number 1, A Constant Noise, where all the score's instructions are to be interpreted with the caveat, don't make any decisions of your own. In this case, and wherever else you'd like to apply it, the rule is ask the composer what they think and contribute nothing. Be a frigid fuck. Punishment number 3, malicious compliance, Weingarten rehearsals. We can also follow the thread of malicious rehearsal strategies in another direction by performing my friend Michal Czech's number 55 Weingarten rehearsals from 2012, a metascore based on the Weingarten rights. Established in 1975 by the National Labor Relations Board, or the NLRB, Weingarten rights give workers the right to have union representation during conversations that they believe could result in adverse effects on him or her, and provides a short script that can be read in order to momentarily halt any aggressive employer in their tracks. Czech rewrites the Weingarten rights disclaimer, motivating the performer to refuse speaking with the composer or director without an audience or live video stream present. If this discussion could in any way lead to my being influenced or disciplined in the Cageian sense, or affect my personal performance conditions or habits, I respectfully request that audience members, spectators, or live streaming video be present at this rehearsal. Until my witnesses arrive, I choose not to participate in this discussion. It should be noted that Czech's work in this case is a direct response to John Cage's practice of calling one-on-one meetings in 1958 with his orchestra members who are about to perform his highly indeterminate piece, Piano and Orchestra. These first 2 methods of malicious compliance primarily work to prolong and chill the atmosphere of rehearsal. In the next 2 forms of work to rule, we aim to punish the composer for clumsy, overly indeterminate instructions in their scores. Punishment number 4, malicious compliance, boring beyond belief. With the boring beyond belief strategy, we start by adapting the leave your brain at the factory gate approach, by refusing to interpret indeterminate instructions in any interesting way, and opting for silence wherever possible. For instance, instructions like as quiet as possible, barely, or choose a low pitch can all be interpreted as inaudible events. This is similarly applied anytime the duration is indeterminate in order to produce a performance that is inordinately long, potentially prompting audience members to leave before the work is finished. The hope is that the maltreated audience won't notice the role of the idiot performers so much as the composer's ego, and will instead project their psychic wrath upon her or him for that gratuitous, boring-ass piece of shit 70s performance art bullshit that we were just watching. Punishment number 5, malicious compliance, malicious minimalism. The final malicious compliance strategy we'll outline here is that of malicious minimalism, wherein the work is collapsed inward on itself into its tiniest, most insignificant, most featureless form. Think of it as a kind of bondage for scores. Adam Overton's Metascore, a musical minimum festival or event from 2009, outlines this exactly. If the work allows for the determination of instrumentation, materials, and/or actions, always choose the simplest ones. If the work allows for the selection of how many tones to play, perform the minimum number of tones. If the work allows for the determination of durations, always perform the shortest ones. If the work gives the performer the option to choose their own dynamic, always choose the least audible one. If the work gives the performer the option of not playing, performing, acting, remain on stage for the duration of the performance without playing, performing, or acting, etc. In February 2010, performers did just this at a concert here at the Wulf in Los Angeles by realizing 13 scores as minimally as compressed as possible, including all 49 of Overton's Posture Series pieces. For example, the Posture Series works, all hand-drawn graphic scores with extremely open instructions, were interpreted by a performer whose quick glance barely traced them with his eyes, and probably covered the entire series in a little under a minute's time. So, the malicious minimalism ideal is akin to boiling the fat and flesh off the score's bones, rendering them as pared down and unrecognizable and unmemorable as possible. Here are a few more simple punishments with which we might lavish the composer. Punishment number 6, cage compression. Perhaps one of the lowest forms of scorn that can be hurled at a composer today is to compare them or their work to the great daddy composer John Cage. Cage compression then follows in the tradition of malicious minimalism, but with the performer attempting to collapse or arrange the composer's indeterminate work to the point that its realization greatly resembles Cage's infamous 4 minutes and 33 seconds, or some other recognizable Cageian opus. Punishment number 7 is forcible narrative. Forcible narrative is outlined in Adam Overton's as yet unperformed Metascore, Summer Pond, Placid Morning. In this case, the ears of the concert audience are poisoned by the performer's or misnaming the composer's work with a narrow, colorful, cinematic title before it's printed in the program. The unwitting audience is hence encouraged to imaginatively destroy the work. Punishment number 8, Tomb of the Unknown Composer. Yet another lash to the composer's ego is to remove his or her name entirely from the works listed on a program, or to claim that they were composed by someone else altogether, perhaps someone the composer severely dislikes. This and the last punishment are united via a post-Cageian understanding that the titling of a work and/or the identity of its composer radically affects how the listener hears the work in performance. Finally, punishment number 9, composer-conductor lockout. Finally, in Michalczyk's piece number 54, Composer-Conductor Lockout from 2012, we find yet another useful labor resistance practice that can work well within the new musical masochistic domain. In her work, Czech outlines a recipe for temporarily suspending a composer and/or conductor from attending and participating in a concert by positioning some locked-arm audience activists at the door before who only open the line for audience and performers. Here again, we postpone any kind of pleasure the composer might stand to face and subject them to humiliation in the face of their friends, audience, and performers. With a draft of our masochistic menu now begun and our leather instrument cases freshly polished, I wish I could say that this proposal ends here. But if you'll bear with me, I wish to prolong what we've got going here between us with just a couple more short statements regarding one last important issue we must address. Though I've tortured you these last 30 or 40 minutes with fantasies of reigniting the passion between consenting composers and performers, I think this form of play has one gaping, perhaps unzippable hole I failed to mention. With all this hot talk, we may have distracted ourselves from the reality that a composer's presence, consent, or even their being alive has never actually been required to perform a score. You, the performer, are indeed free to do with these scores as you please, with or without the composer, before or after their death, as disciplined or as foolishly as you desire. Having the composer present so that you might witness the humiliation spread across their dour, cringing temple is a sublime fetish all its own, but not a requirement precluding your own pleasure. In their absence, we needn't heed the composer's supposed and anxious third-level innuendos anymore, nor those of their honorific sepulchral guardians like Peter Kodak, who threatened to strangle us with Cage's invisible umbilical cord. Unless, of course, that just happens to turn you on. I would argue that there continue to be many pleasures to be had alone with the masochistic score that promise us prolonged evenings of textual, performative ravishment as we twiddle with the possible meanings of its instructions and tickle-torture the spirit of its author. For these reasons, I suggest we invoke the great ghost of Bart and call now for the death of the composer, hoping that our interpretive humiliation might cross that great expanse to where our heroes are rolling in their graves, so that we might now live to haunt them. Dear Severin, down on your bended knee, our sacred master, we performers join you now in this new masochistic age, aching to cure your heart. Our whip awaits your command. Oh, it's too small. Uh-oh.
It's a great equalizer.
The crack of the whip is smartest. Anyways, that's it. Thank you. We're gonna pause for about 5 to 10 minutes with a brief intermission, and then I'll be back with Kristi Anderson and Mike Winner, and we're going to present Tomb of the Unknown Composer in a series of pieces, including a piece by Michael Winner, a piece by Roach Pitt, and a piece by Dieter Wohl. And there are programs by the front of the